Australian wine has gone through quite a change in the last 10 to 15 years. Back in the 1980s, 70s, it started building up, changed from the market of fortifieds into the 80s. A lot of table wine got really popular. In the 90s, there was a agglomeration of independent family-run businesses that basically got bought up by two very large companies. And then since the 90s and the internationalisation of Australian wines and the popularity of a different style of Australian wine, actually, that big kind of oaky, fruity red style became very popular internationally, particularly in the US and the British market. There's been a change in direction a little bit, and a lot of boutique wineries have appeared, and the two major companies, stakeholders, have kind of lost their market share a little comparatively, at least in the areas of the market where perhaps people who are more interested in wine would seek something rather than the bulk end of the market. And in the last probably 10 to 15 years, there's been even more of a move, not just in the boutique, but in exploring different varieties, in exploring different techniques in the winemaking, and different techniques even in the viticulture. So biodynamics and, more natural, for lack of a better word, style of winemaking has become popular as well. And even the packaging has changed. I mean, it's really been quite an exciting time in Australian wine in the last 10 to 15 years because of all of these changes. So today I'm going to show one example of that, which I've never tried before actually. Don't know this wine, but this already, just by the package, exemplifies what I'm talking about. The front label has absolutely no writing on it whatsoever. It's actually an embossed label with a velvety feel. I mean, that's the extent to which the presentation even of wines has changed. And the back label does have a little bit of information, but not very much information. And that again is a stylistic change even in the packaging. Screw cap, of course, which is very common in the Antipodes now. It's pretty much the standard, which is no bad thing really. This particular one though, the producer is called Save Our Souls, and this is Sagrantino from 2015. Sagrantino is an Italian grape variety, so again, not an international variety, not very common, not seen much even outside of Italy, to be honest. It comes from the Umbria region of Italy. It's kind of in the middle of Italy, and Montefalco is the appellational region where it's typically seen in Italy. This particular wine comes from the Murray-Darling region, which is quite an extensive region actually in Australia, and where a lot of not very good quality wines have traditionally come from. Very fruit forward, easy, pretty dull bulk market kind of wines have come from. But this one in particular, I think it comes from near Mildura on the Victorian side of the border. But the fruit is transported to the Yarra where the facilities of these winemakers are. I think there's a history of these winemakers which I won't go into, but basically they've worked for some more of the nationally recognised winemakers in the circuit. Anyway, fruit transported to the Yarra. Sagrantino, that's 100% destemmed, fermented naturally, no yeast additions, no sulfur, no nothing at the crush, and then just fermented naturally, and I believe aged in oak for 6 months, neutral oak though. And then a little bit of sulfur dioxide at bottling, but not much, and no fining, no filtration. So it's a more kind of hands-off approach, which again is another change perhaps in the industry, where there's been a move more towards making wine without as much intervention in the winery, just trying to let the fruit speak for itself. So Sagrantino in Australia, in a region that traditionally hasn't grown particularly interesting wine, but these guys have a different philosophy, different approach. Let's see what Save Our Souls can make of Sagrantino. Pretty, it's quite a purpley colour, but it's not, it's actually quite deep, and it's kind of brooding kind of colour, not particularly bright. There's not much pink to it. A little bit even murky actually, which I suppose is characteristic of that kind of more natural approach to the winemaking. It's not been fined or filtered, so there's still a bit in suspension there perhaps. And on the nose it's quite does actually smell like often natural wines can smell. Has a certain wildness to it perhaps. And it also has some nice crunchy, bright kind of red fruit there as well, particularly cherry, which you might expect from Sagrantino. A little bit of plum maybe. And there's a touch of spice to it, I think, as well. Stewed, maybe a little stewed fruit, stewed plum with a bit of spice in it. And it also has that wild edge in terms of some vegetation going on. Really quite different for the region that it comes from, really presenting different characteristics to what is often expected of the region. It's actually quite fat in the mouth. Reasonably weighty actually. 13.5% alcohol. High acid. It's quite zingy actually. It almost has a citrus kind of zing to the acidity. Zippy. It leaves the mouth fresh. It's not particularly long. It has some tannin to it, but it's quite smooth and soft. But they're quite textural. There's quite a bit of them in suspension, it almost feels. Like colloidal kind of suspension of tannins. This, for me, is pretty exemplary of the modern style of the new, what I call the new wave of Australia. This is a great variety that hasn't traditionally been seen much in Australia, from a region that typically wouldn't do such a thing, made in a style that, or made with a winemaking philosophy that is quite natural, non-interventionist, but it also has some of the problems that I feel are present in that style of wine in Australia. The palate balance perhaps isn't quite right compared to how it could be. It has a heaviness still to it. Possibly the alcohol's a bit high. The acid is a little out of place. So it's how I tend to feel about a lot of this new wave stuff. It's philosophically fantastic. It's great that they're looking for a new direction, but maybe in terms of actual drinkability, the balance isn't quite there. Nevertheless, a lot of people like this kind of stuff. It is interesting, it is different, and if you don't mind things that are maybe a little bit different in terms of their palate feel, maybe you can pass that by. You're okay with it for the other interesting things that it has to offer. And it's not that expensive either. I think this is around $20 or so retail, $20-25. So, if you want to explore something different, in Australia, the kind of styles that are changing the face of Australian wine, then Save Your Souls is one of those producers. And trying a different grape variety that has a different expression because it's grown in Australia rather than Italy. Its traditional home, also something worth trying. How do you feel?
I agree. It's not. There are a few things that stand out that aren't quite balanced, but I still find it really interesting. It is big when it comes in your mouth, but that acid line through the middle really cleans up. It's very mandarin for me.
Yeah, it is.
And it's a little bit floral, like on a mandarin you can get some sort of soft florals and things. It's quite like that. So I find it quite nice, really, in that sense.
Yeah.
And I wonder if, being an Italian grape variety, maybe those sort of gaps or misbalances in it are, what you can get on a lot of drinkable Italian wines, and that it needs the food and it'll fill in the gaps. And
yeah, very true.
Maybe it's just being true to its home country.
Yeah, indeed. And maybe that's the thing, that also the move in Aussie wine towards wines that are just there to drink, just with some
rustic
food. Yeah, I think that's a great thing. And I criticise it a bit for its balance, but it's not bad. I could certainly drink a glass of this. I'm happy. It's not like I'm struggling.
Yeah,
it's just not perfect either.
I think it's going down pretty well. It's interesting what you were saying at the beginning about the changes that have happened in Australia, and in terms of the new wave. And I guess we're quite lucky here in that we're not constrained by the old, very strict rules and laws, in the old world. And maybe there's been quite a lot more innovation here. So you see people planting random things and experimenting with the soil and what's going to work best with the terroir, and not not getting too stuck on that.
That's true. I mean, everywhere has their innovation in some sense, I think. Bordeaux had its micro-ox and, riper fruit, and even in Italy, the wave of super Tuscans, bringing in international or French varieties blending into the indigenous varieties, made a completely new style that sat outside the appellation rules. But Australia has always been very good at innovation, particularly in technology and in viticulture. So, this is where the industry's come in 10, 15 years, moving. Where's it going to be in another 10, 15 years? Probably in quite a different place. It's a very dynamic environment. That makes it a country that's really interesting in terms of following wine styles.
And as people explore the microclimates and the soils in different areas and how varied they are, and they're not constrained by the old styles, and they can plant whatever they like there. Exactly. Who knows what we'll end up with?
We're free to explore. Yeah. Although I do think the changes, particularly in the last 20 years, it's a little sad because a lot of the traditional styles they're kind of lost. Yeah, well, they're not lost, but they've been forgotten or devalued, perhaps. Like Hunter Semillon is a unique style. The traditional style of Hunter Semillon, it's like 11% alcohol, starts out as a citrusy, grassy, lean, ultra lean style of wine, and then after many years in bottle becomes toasty. It's almost like it's had oak aging, but it hasn't had any oak. Richer, fatter, gains weight on the palate. It becomes a really delicious style, and that's really not valued. And even Australian Rieslings are not really that valued. They're still cheap, even in Australia. They're not really valued. People go for a Sauvignon Blanc over a Riesling. And in the reds, things like Coonawarra Cabernet or the traditional style of Hunter Shiraz, they're not really valued that much anymore.
Had a bit of bread on them.
Oh, well, yeah. The style of Hunter Shiraz has completely changed, and it's really actually hard to get those traditional styles now. So that's one side of it. The traditional styles have kind of been almost neglected, and the other side is the newer wave. I mean, I guess they'll find their way, and yes, it's nice that they've gone through this innovation, but I think they're still finding their way, to my taste anyway. But it's an interesting, as I say, dynamic environment to be following. And I'm not someone who, is patriotic or nationalistic in any sense at all. When it comes to Australian wine, if I was going to choose one country to drink wine from for the rest of my life, it'd be France. It wouldn't be Australia. No way. But having said that, it's quite exciting to follow the changes in Australian wine styles and to explore the diversity of what's actually available. Yeah.
You had any Sagrantinos from Italy, from the traditional Umbria region?
Yes, but not for a long time.
Can you sort of remember how you found them? Or?
I feel like from memory, they're fairly easy drinking, fairly simple, red fruited, with a little bit of tannin, good acid kind of style of wine. But they're nothing that most people would write home about, which perhaps is why they're not really heard of that much or known that well. Probably in its Australian carnation here, as I find most of the cases, the wine is the style is a little bit riper. The fruit gets a little bit riper in Australia, and it's a little bit smoother, and the alcohol's a little bit higher. It's a little fuller on the palate. But I think this particular one, it's saves itself by that refreshing acidity.
Surprising, given the Murray-Darling's a hot region, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah.
So they've constrained,
reined it in a little bit, at least, perhaps.
I agree. There's maybe a little bit of an element of stewed fruit, but it's still you get this sense on the nose is that there's this crunchy red, really tight-skinned cherries, and maybe even cranberry or something like that, or a reddy greeny apple with a really tight, crunchy skin.
Exactly. There's actually a fair bit of apple on this. That's the acetaldehyde, which I'd say is the oxidation of the fruit, because it's been made, without any sulfur dioxide, so it's oxidized slightly. That's often a telltale of a non-interventionist style of wine making. But it doesn't come across too crassly here for me.
I think it fits in with that crunchy, fresh fruit, and the acid and that kind of thing. Not a powdery, overly red apple. That's been sitting out and browned.
So there are a lot of these kind of more natural, non-interventionist styles of wine in Australia being made now. Save Our Souls is just one example. There are heaps of them. So if you're interested in trying something different that's Aussie, not just grape variety wise, but seek out something that is being made in a more non-interventionist way, that's from a region that you've never heard of before. Not the Barossa, not McLaren Vale, not Hunter, not Margaret River, and check it out, because you might really like it. They're doing some very different things. It's important to come back to a wine though, having sat with it for a little while. Sometimes you come back to something and it's really not doing it for you. This, second, third glass are just a struggle. And other times you come back and you find other things in a great wine. This particular one, I am seeing other things in it. I wouldn't say it's fantastic still, but I feel like I was probably a little hard on it before. I think aromatically, it's still showing that cherry and the plum, the spiced plum, stewed plum even, but there's also some baked strawberry with a little pepper on it, the cranberry thing. Well, it's really quite bright and juicy kind of fruits, which are pretty attractive. And on the palate, it's not leaving me feeling like it's totally out of balance and I don't want to come back to it. It's got tannins that are really quite textural, really, really attractive kind of texture to them. They're very slightly grainy and astringent, and they go throughout the mouth actually as the palate progresses, and they fill out the palate in a way that keeps it interesting, I suppose. The acid is really zingy, really quite zingy actually. So you probably have to like that kind of thing, but it keeps it again quite interesting. And whilst it's a full style, I think the fact that the tannins, it's got some weight to it. The tannins and that zingy acidity kind of keep it fresh enough that you can keep coming back to it and it doesn't become tiring. So despite the fact that it's maybe not perfectly balanced, it's not perfectly elegant as a style, it's still a really enjoyable, juicy, nicely fruited, not too simple, interestingly textured style of wine, and shows its characteristics in terms of it being true to its Italian roots, I'd say, and true to its philosophy of being wine that's made in that more kind of natural or non-interventionist kind of style. So, yeah, Save Our Souls Sagrantino, this particular one being the 2015, with a very modern package. Yeah, check it out. It's only, $20-25 retail Australian. Worth trying.